There was a moment when you started wondering if God had forgotten you, not angrily, not dramatically, quietly. You kept praying, you kept believing, you kept doing what you thought was right, and still, nothing moved. Doors stayed closed, answers stayed silent, time kept passing. You remember that feeling, watching other people move forward while you stayed right where you were, trying not to compare, trying not to question, trying not to let disappointment turn into doubt. You told yourself, God has a plan, but deep down another thought kept returning. Why does it feel like everyone else's life is unfolding except mine? From your side, it looked like delay. From heaven's side, it looked like protection. There was a night when you replayed the same prayer for the 100th time, same words, same hope, same ache in your chest. And when nothing changed, you felt that familiar temptation to take matters into your own hands, to force a door, to rush a decision, to accept something that wasn't right just to stop waiting. You didn't want to disobey God. You were just tired of standing still. Standing still can feel like failure when you don't understand what God is doing. You started asking questions you never thought you would ask. Did I hear you wrong? Did I miss my moment? Am I being punished? Or am I just forgotten? You didn't say those things out loud, but heaven heard them anyway. And right there, in that space between faith and frustration, God leaned in closer than you realized, not to hurry you, not to scold you, but to reveal something you couldn't see from where you were standing. Because the delay was not empty. It was loaded with protection you didn't ask for, loaded with preparation you didn't know you needed, loaded with timing that would make sense only later. From your side, it felt like being held back. From heaven's side, it was being held safe. You weren't behind. You weren't late, you weren't overlooked, you were being positioned. And the reason this waiting hurts so much is because God is not just preparing the outcome, He's preparing you. There are things you want right now that would break you if they arrived too early. There are doors you keep knocking on that look good, feel right, and still would have cost you more than you can imagine. You can't see that yet, but heaven can. And that is why God's timing often feels like silence, because while nothing seems to be happening on the surface, everything is being arranged behind the scenes. The delay is not punishment. It is not neglect. It is not God testing how long you can suffer. It is Him loving you enough to say, not yet. You're not ready. They're not ready. The moment isn't aligned, but I am still here. And if you listen closely, beneath the frustration, beneath the waiting, you'll hear it. Not a command, not a timeline, but a steady whisper meant to hold you while you wait. Trust me with the timing. From your side, that feels hard. From heaven's side, it's everything. Waiting did something to you that you never expected. At first, it just felt frustrating. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the prayer that once felt hopeful started to feel heavy. You kept asking God for clarity, for movement, for something, and all you seemed to get back was silence, not rejection, silence. That kind of silence is harder to sit with, because rejection at least gives you an answer. Silence leaves room for questions, and questions, when they linger too long, start to shape beliefs. You caught yourself thinking things you never meant to believe. Maybe I'm not trusted with what I'm asking for. Maybe I missed my window. Maybe this promise was never really for me. You didn't want to think that way, but waiting has a way of wearing down your defenses. It doesn't attack you loudly. It slowly erodes hope by repetition, by showing you the same closed door over and over again until you start wondering if the door was ever meant to open. From your side, it felt like God was distant, but heaven saw something else. He saw how much you were growing in places you never would have chosen. Patience was being formed. Discernment was being sharpened. Dependence was being redirected away from outcomes toward presence. You were learning how to stay connected to God without constant reassurance. That kind of faith is not loud. It's quiet, and it's strong. You started to realize that if God gave you everything the moment you asked for it, you might trust answers more than you trust Him. So He stayed close, even while staying silent. Not absent, present, present in the way he kept you from forcing things, present in the unease you felt about certain shortcuts, present in the restlessness that rose every time you tried to settle for something that wasn't aligned. Those weren't obstacles, they were warnings. God was protecting you from stepping into something too early just to escape the pain of waiting. You were being taught that timing matters as much as intention, that good desires placed in the wrong moment can still lead to harm. There were days you wanted to quit waiting altogether, to make a decision just to regain a sense of control. But every time you moved in that direction, peace disappeared. Not dramatically, subtly, and you knew this wasn't right. That knowing was God's hand on your chest, gently saying, "Stay, don't rush this. I see more than you can see." Waiting was stretching you, but it wasn't wasting you. And even though you couldn't feel it yet, heaven was aligning details you would one day look back on and realize, if this had happened sooner, it would have cost you more than you were ready to pay. If it had come later, you might have missed it entirely. God's timing was not random, it was precise, and the reason it hurt was because it was personal. You weren't being delayed because you were unworthy. You were being delayed because what was coming was valuable. And heaven does not release what is valuable into unprepared hands. So you stayed, not because it was easy, but because somewhere deep inside, you still trusted the God who was asking you to wait. And that trust, formed in silence, was becoming the foundation for everything that was still ahead. There were moments when waiting felt personal, not like a neutral pause, not like a simple delay. It felt targeted, like God was answering everyone else's prayers while yours sat untouched. You watched doors open for people who didn't seem more faithful than you. You saw opportunities appear for those who hadn't prayed half as hard. And you tried, you really tried, not to compare. But comparison crept in anyway. It whispered, "What are they doing right that you're doing wrong?" That question hurt because it assumed delay meant deficiency. That if God hadn't moved yet, you must have failed some invisible test. Heaven saw that lie forming quietly in you. And that's when God began to confront not your patience, but your understanding of how He works. He reminded you that timing in the kingdom has never been democratic. Abraham waited decades for a promise. Joseph waited years in obscurity and prison before purpose caught up with him. David was anointed king and then sent back to the fields and later into caves, while Saul stayed on the throne. Waiting has always been part of God's pattern, not because He enjoys watching people suffer, but because calling without formation destroys people. You began to see that God was not punishing you by making you wait. He was protecting you from arriving somewhere before you were ready to stay there. From your side, waiting felt like stagnation. From heaven's side, it was stabilization. God was anchoring your identity so it wouldn't be swallowed by the thing you were asking for. Because unanswered prayer reveals something important. What you believe will finally make you whole. If the blessing comes too early, it can quietly replace God instead of pointing you back to Him. That's why heaven sometimes withholds movement. Not to deny you, but to keep your heart aligned. You notice this in yourself. The longer you waited, the more honest your prayers became. At first, you prayed for outcomes. Now, you prayed for strength, for wisdom, for clarity, for the ability to stay faithful without visible progress. And that shift mattered, because God wasn't just preparing the answer, He was preparing the container, you. There were still days you wanted to rush Him, to say, "Lord, I've learned enough. I'm ready now." But heaven, seeing further than you could, kept holding the timeline, not out of control, out of care. You didn't realize it yet, but some of the things you were begging God to remove were the very things keeping you safe from a version of your future that looked good but would have quietly undone you. Waiting was refining your discernment. It was teaching you the difference between urgency and alignment, between desire and assignment, between good opportunities and God opportunities. And slowly, without a single dramatic moment, you began to understand something that changed how you waited. God's delays are never empty. They are filled with unseen preparation, with protection you didn't request, with wisdom you didn't know you were missing. The waiting wasn't proof that God had forgotten you. It was proof that He was paying very close attention. There was a point when waiting stopped being passive and started feeling dangerous. Not because time was passing, but because temptation was growing. The temptation to help God. You told yourself you weren't being rebellious, just practical, just realistic. If God isn't moving, maybe this is my cue to move on. If the door isn't opening, maybe I'm supposed to build my own. That's how it usually sounds. Reasonable, measured, almost spiritual. But heaven saw what was underneath it. You weren't trying to disobey God. You were trying to escape the discomfort of waiting. Waiting exposes something control likes to hide, that you are not in charge of outcomes, and that realization can feel unbearable when your heart is tired. You began to notice how quickly peace vanished when you imagined forcing a solution. Every shortcut looked good on paper, but felt wrong in your spirit. Every rushed decision came with a quiet unease you couldn't ignore. That unease wasn't fear, it was discernment. God was teaching you how to recognize the difference. Fear shouts, "Do something now or you'll lose everything." Discernment whispers, "Wait, this isn't aligned." The problem was, both voices felt urgent, so you had to learn how to tell them apart. You started asking yourself new questions. Does this bring peace or just relief? Does this align with who God is shaping me to be, or does it only end my discomfort? Those questions slowed you down. They kept you from grabbing the first exit just to stop the ache. You also began to see how much pressure you were putting on yourself to be somewhere by now. An age, a season, a milestone. You carried invisible timelines that God never gave you. And every time you fell behind them, you felt shame, as if delay meant failure. God gently dismantled that. He reminded you that growth is not linear, that calling is not a race, that His timeline does not compete with anyone else's. From heaven's side, you weren't behind. You were right where you needed to be to become who you needed to be. Waiting was not holding you back. It was keeping you from moving forward as someone you hadn't yet become. That realization didn't remove the longing, but it gave it meaning. You could wait without despising the season. You could stay without feeling forgotten. You could trust that when God finally said, "Now," you wouldn't have to force anything. The door would open because it was time, not because you pushed until it broke. And deep down, something in you began to rest in that. Waiting began to change the way you listened. Before, you were always searching for clear instructions, a sign, a confirmation, a sentence that would finally say, "Now is the moment." But in the quiet stretch of delay, God taught you something subtler. He taught you how to listen for alignment, not just permission. You started noticing that when something was right, it carried a different weight. Not urgency, not pressure, peace. Even if it was challenging, even if it required courage, peace was still there, steady, present, unforced. And when something wasn't right, no matter how logical it sounded, your spirit felt tight, not afraid, restricted. That distinction mattered, because fear and misalignment feel different, but only if you slow down enough to notice. God was retraining your discernment. He was showing you that His timing often reveals itself not through excitement, but through clarity. You also realized how often impatience had masqueraded as faith. You told yourself, "I'm just being bold." But boldness without peace is usually pressure in disguise. True faith doesn't rush God, it walks with Him. That truth confronted you gently. It invited you to stop trying to sound confident and start being honest. So your prayers changed again. You stopped asking, "Lord, is this the door?" and started asking, "Lord, is my heart aligned with you right now?" That shift did something deep. It moved your focus from outcomes to presence, from timing to trust, from arrival to obedience, and in that space, Waiting stopped feeling like wasted time. It became relational time, time where God revealed not just what he wanted to give you, but who he wanted to be to you. You noticed how much calmer your spirit became when you stopped measuring progress by visible movement. Some days still felt slow, some nights still felt long, but you no longer felt abandoned inside them. God was there, teaching you how to walk without constant reassurance, how to trust without constant proof, how to stay faithful even when the timeline remained hidden. That kind of faith is not flashy, but it is durable. It doesn't collapse when answers take longer. It doesn't panic when plans stall. It stays, and heaven values that. You didn't realize it yet, but this season was building something in you that would matter more than speed ever could. Stability. The ability to receive a blessing without being consumed by it. The strength to hold responsibility without losing yourself. God was slowing you down on purpose, not to punish you, but to prepare you for a future that would require a deeper root system than you had before. And even though you still didn't know when the waiting would end, you were beginning to sense that when it did, you would step forward, not desperate, not rushed, but ready. There were days when you wondered if waiting was changing you in ways you didn't recognize, not always gently. Some days it softened you. Other days it exposed places you didn't know were still raw. Waiting has a way of bringing everything to the surface. The hopes you tried to keep quiet, the fears you thought were healed, the impatience you didn't know was still shaping your decisions. You began to see how much of your faith had been tied to momentum. As long as things were moving, you felt confident. But when progress slowed, your confidence wavered. God wasn't condemning you for that. He was revealing it. Because faith that only works when life is advancing is fragile. God wanted to give you something sturdier, something that could stand even when nothing changed. There were moments you felt the urge to reinterpret the promise, to shrink it, to spiritualize it, to tell yourself you didn't want it that badly anyway. Not because the desire disappeared, but because disappointment felt easier than hope deferred. God saw that too, and instead of correcting you sharply, he stayed close. He reminded you that desire itself is not the enemy. Impatience is. Wanting something deeply does not disqualify you. Rushing to escape the wanting often does. You began to notice how God kept you from settling. Opportunities came. Not terrible ones, not sinful ones, just almost right ones. And every time you considered them, something inside you hesitated. Not fear, recognition. You knew enough now to tell the difference. God was protecting you from choosing relief over alignment. That protection didn't always feel kind in the moment. Sometimes it felt like frustration, sometimes like loneliness, sometimes like being misunderstood by people who couldn't see what you were waiting for. But heaven wasn't confused. Heaven knew exactly why you couldn't move yet. There were things still unfolding, not just around you, but within you. Your capacity was expanding, your discernment was sharpening, your identity was detaching from outcomes. God was making sure that when the answer arrived, you wouldn't cling to it as your source. You would receive it as a gift, not as a replacement for Him. That realization began to shift something in you. You stopped asking God to hurry. You started asking Him to keep you aligned. Don't let me outrun you. Don't let me force what isn't ready. Don't let impatience undo what you're building. Those prayers were quieter, but they were deeper. They came from a place that trusted God's heart, even when His hand seemed still. You were learning that divine timing isn't about waiting passively. It's about staying connected while God works on layers you can't yet see. And slowly, almost without noticing, you became someone who could wait without losing yourself. That growth was not visible to others. But heaven saw it clearly, and heaven knew you were getting closer. There came a moment when waiting stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling intentional, not easier, not painless, but purposeful. You began to notice how God was shielding you from certain paths without making a scene. Things that once tempted you lost their pull, not because they were wrong, but because they were no longer right. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly, through repetition. Through moments where you almost moved forward and then didn't, where something looked promising and yet your spirit stayed calm, not excited, not drawn, just aware. You realized that God wasn't just delaying answers, He was narrowing focus, removing distractions, refining desire, so that when the right moment came, you wouldn't hesitate or second guess. You would know. You also noticed how waiting changed the way you handled disappointment. Before, disappointment felt like proof that something was wrong with you. Now it felt more like information, a sign that something was still unfolding. Not a verdict, not a failure, just a signal to stay present. God was teaching you how to hold unanswered prayers without letting them harden you. That was new. You didn't become numb. You became flexible. Hope bent, but didn't break. You also began to see how much pressure you had placed on outcomes to validate your faith. As if God's goodness was only confirmed by visible results, waiting dismantled that belief. It forced you to confront a deeper question. Would I still trust God if this takes longer than I planned? That question was uncomfortable, but honest. And God honors honesty, so He met you there, not with explanations, not with dates, but with reassurance. A steady sense that you were not forgotten, that He was not slow, that He was not indifferent. He was exact. He was arranging details that required precision, people, timelines, circumstances, your own readiness, things that could not be rushed without consequences. From your side, waiting felt empty. From heaven's side, it was full of alignment, full of protection, full of preparation. You also noticed how waiting clarified your priorities. Some things you once thought were essential quietly lost their importance. Other things, character, peace, integrity, presence, became non-negotiable. God was reshaping what success even meant to you, not as arrival, but as alignment, not as speed, but as faithfulness. That reframing changed how you waited. You stopped counting days. You stopped measuring yourself against others' timelines. You focused on staying close instead of staying busy. And that closeness did something profound. It anchored you, so that when movement finally came, and it would, you wouldn't move out of desperation. You would move out of obedience. That difference is everything, because what begins in desperation often ends in exhaustion. But what begins in obedience is sustained by grace. And heaven knew, when the timing shifted, you would be ready not just to receive, but to remain. There were signs you almost missed, not dramatic ones, not moments that demanded attention. Small shifts, a growing calm where anxiety used to live, a quiet confidence that didn't need reassurance to survive. You realized that waiting had begun to rewire how you saw yourself. You were no longer measuring your worth by how fast things happened. You stopped equating movement with approval. That was a deep healing, because for a long time you believed progress proved you were doing something right, and delay meant you were failing. God gently dismantled that belief. He showed you that some of the most obedient seasons look like stillness from the outside. That some of the most powerful preparation happens when nothing seems to be happening. You also noticed how waiting changed your reactions to other people's success. Before, it stung, not because you weren't happy for them, but because their movement highlighted your pause. Now their progress no longer threatened you. It didn't feel like evidence that you were behind. It felt like confirmation that God moves at different speeds for different callings. That realization freed your heart. You could celebrate others without silently grieving yourself. You could bless their timing without resenting yours. God was teaching you how to trust His plan without comparing it to anyone else's. That trust was fragile at first. Some days you held it well. Other days you felt it slip. But even on the days when doubt crept back in, you noticed something new. You returned faster. You didn't stay lost in frustration for as long. You didn't spiral into self-blame. You didn't assume you had done something wrong. You simply brought your questions back to God. Help me wait well. That prayer became more important than knowing when. You also realized that waiting was teaching you how to be content without being complacent. You still showed up, you still prepared, you still stayed faithful to what was in front of you, but you stopped living as if your life hadn't started yet. You stopped postponing joy until everything aligned. You let yourself live inside the season you were in, finding meaning in the work, connection in the people, peace in the present. That was a turning point, because waiting no longer felt like life on hold. It felt like life with a deeper awareness. You began to sense that something was shifting, not outwardly, internally. Your grip was loosening, your trust was strengthening. Your need to control outcomes was quietly losing power. God wasn't rushing this part, because this part mattered. This was the part that would determine how you carried the blessing when it finally arrived. He wasn't just preparing the moment, he was preparing the posture, so that when he said, "Now," you wouldn't step forward with clenched fists, but with open hands, ready to receive without fear, ready to move without panic, ready to trust without needing every detail explained. The waiting was doing its work. And even if you couldn't see the finish line yet, you could feel it. Something in you was becoming ready. There came a day when the waiting didn't feel as heavy as it used to, not because it ended, but because it changed. You noticed it in the way you responded to uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt like danger, something to eliminate as quickly as possible. Now, it felt like space for God to move without interference, space for wisdom to arrive without being forced, space for trust to deepen instead of collapse. You realized that somewhere along the way, your fear of delay had softened. You still wanted answers, you still hoped for movement, but you no longer felt like your life was shrinking because you were waiting. You began to see how many things God had quietly kept from you during this season. Relationships that would have drained you, responsibilities you weren't yet equipped to carry, decisions that looked harmless but would have pulled you off course. Heaven had been intercepting outcomes you never knew were possible, and suddenly the delay felt less like absence and more like protection. You also noticed how your prayers sounded now. They were less frantic, less demanding, more grounded. You weren't bargaining anymore. You weren't trying to convince God to move faster. You were simply staying close. "Whenever you're ready, Lord, I trust you." That trust was not passive. It was active surrender. The kind that keeps showing up, keeps obeying, keeps believing without needing immediate results. You realize that divine timing doesn't just shape outcomes, it shapes character. It teaches you how to remain steady when progress is invisible, how to stay faithful when affirmation is delayed, how to trust God's heart when His hand appears still. You began to understand why God couldn't rush this season. If the answer had come earlier, you might have received it with anxiety instead of gratitude. If it had arrived sooner, you might have clung to it instead of holding it loosely. Waiting was making you safe for the blessing. That thought settled deep. God wasn't withholding, He was safeguarding. You stopped asking, "Why hasn't this happened yet?" and started asking, "What is this season building in me?" That question changed everything, because now even the delay had purpose. Even the silence had meaning. Even the unanswered prayer was doing work inside your heart. You didn't know how much longer the waiting would last, but you knew this. You were no longer afraid of it. You trusted the God who stood with you inside it, and that trust made the waiting lighter, not easy, but holy. One day, you will look back at this season and understand why God didn't rush, not with bitterness, with gratitude. You'll see how close you came to stepping into things that looked right, but would have cost you peace. You'll recognize how many moments He quietly intercepted, decisions you didn't make, paths you didn't take, doors you almost forced, but didn't. And you'll realize that the waiting was never empty. It was full of protection, full of formation, full of mercy you didn't know how to ask for. From your side, it felt like being held back. From heaven's side, it was being held together. God was not delaying to test your endurance. He was aligning your life with something sustainable, something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of arrival. You will see how much stronger you became without noticing, how your trust deepened, how your identity stopped being tied to timelines, how your faith learned to breathe without constant movement. And when the moment finally comes, when the door opens, when the answer arrives, when the season shifts, you won't step forward desperate or frantic. You'll move with clarity, with peace, with a heart that knows this didn't come late, it came right. Because divine timing is not about speed, it's about safety. It's about alignment between who you are becoming and what God is releasing. You won't need to rush to hold it together. You won't need to fear losing it. You'll know it was given in the right season by the right hand. And even now, before anything changes outwardly, God wants you to hear this. You are not forgotten. You are not behind. You are not being punished. You are being positioned. Every delay, every pause, every unanswered prayer has been wrapped in intention. Heaven has not lost track of your story. And if waiting feels heavy again, you are allowed to return here, to this reminder, to this truth, to this steady presence. If this message spoke to your heart, you are welcome to stay close to divine frequency. Let this be a place you return to when waiting feels long, when answers feel distant, when trust needs strengthening. Because in God's hands, time is never wasted, and in His timing, nothing meant for you will miss you.